Good morning. Welcome to another Tuesday Tea-ology. And I hope that your week is underway well. I'm glad you've stopped in to join us for a cuppa and to think about the majesty of God. That is our topic today. Today is the last one in this series talking about the attributes of God. And we have gone through the uh, the natural attributes of God, the attributes of God's greatness, and then the moral attributes of God, the attributes of God's goodness. And even when we arrive upon a framework which is artificial, but to try to characterize, to try to show the connections and to make a certain progression in our understanding of the character of God, of who God is, what God is like. Even when we make a framework like that, nonetheless, there it is far from perfect. Even these characteristics, the basic characteristics we put, are really only sort of right. After all, God's love is certainly not unnatural to him. Sorting it in the moral attributes is not to say that it's not natural. And indeed, there is something moral about God's power and about everything about him. So these are artificial, and there's certain ones that are especially difficult to categorize. And at the very beginning of the list, I put the holiness of God, which is difficult to categorize, whether you put that in as a natural or a moral attribute, an attribute of greatness and goodness. It really helps to show that the schema only carries so far. And now at the end, we're going to talk about the greatness of God, the majesty of God, the beauty of God. And that kind of shares some of the same characteristics. It's hard to decide which category to fit that into. And it reminds us once again that this is just a framework for helping us to understand, and it is far from perfect, and it doesn't capture anything. And in fact, as we look at it, we're going to see that the holiness of God and the glory of God have certain connections. And so it's fitting that these two attributes, which particularly disrupt our framework and remind us of its limits, also could be placed at the beginning and at the end and help to temper the whole thing. So, the glory of God, the majesty of God, the beauty and splendor of God. With those words, we try to capture this concept, this characteristic of the Lord, that he is awesome, that he is uh, beyond our ability to withstand in his splendor. It's difficult to encapsulate uh, what this really means, but as we can appreciate greatness for its power and might, and say, wow, that's vast and amazing. And we can appreciate goodness for its moral delight, and we say that is so uh, overwhelming, the love of God and things like that. So when it comes to the glory of God, like the holiness of God, it is overwhelming for the sheer magnificence of who God is. And we can get an inkling of this if we think about our aesthetic aesthetics, the sense of beauty. And some people maybe are more sensitive about beauty than others, and that's fine. There's all kinds of folks. But many people, I think, can relate that sometimes you leave work, you go outside, you're walking to your car, and you are just captured by the magnificence of the sunset. Oh, or you go and you take a trip to some fantastic scenery. Maybe you get to live among fantastic scenery, but you go and you look upon the mountains and the majesty of the peaks. You go to the ocean and you watch the waves crashing in their splendor. And there is a sense that can come of just being practically overwhelmed by the beauty, the glory, the majesty of the created world. And then take that now and think about the one who created that world. How magnificent must he be? But his splendor often lies beyond our aesthetic sense. We can think about it, and there are times in the scriptures we're going to look at when the visibility of God's glory was made present, uh, but uh, but in part we often see it as it is reflected in nature. The beauty of nature is a reflection of the beauty and splendor of God. Let's go to a few scriptures here to talk about this subject of the glory of God. In the book of Exodus, chapter 24, so Israel has come out of Egypt, and God reveals his glory in some visible ways that the people behold and are awed by. Of course, God's glory has already been revealed to them, for example, in the terrifying plagues upon Egypt, that God is able to do these things. But in Exodus chapter 24, verses 16 and 17, we read, "The glory of the Lord dwelt on Mount Sinai, and the cloud covered it 6 days. And on the seventh day he called to Moses out of the midst of the cloud. Now the appearance of the glory of the Lord was like a devouring fire on the top of the mountain in the sight of the people of Israel." So God made manifest his glory to his people in these visual images, and it's very interesting. You have a cloud, and also you have devouring fire, and so these are two pictures, both of which give you a sense of vastness, things beyond our control, especially fire, devouring. And there even you begin to see some of the connection. God's holiness, this image of fire connects with that too, beauty, but also uh, consuming power, the wonder, the majesty of God. And his glory, as he reveals himself to his people, as he shows his glory in what he does, as you behold the beauty of God's character, this then becomes a central feature in the worship of God's people. So we come to First Chronicles chapter 16, beginning in verse 28. David is giving these words. David, the great poet king. And he says, "Ascribe to the Lord, O families of the peoples, ascribe to the Lord glory and strength. Ascribe to the Lord the glory due his name. Bring an offering and come before him. Worship the Lord in the splendor of holiness. Tremble before him, all the earth. Yes, the world is established, it shall never be moved." And so you see, what do you see in here? You see a calling to look to the glory of God, to proclaim his glory. And so worship and the glory of God are strongly connected. It is the adoration of God in his magnificence. This phrase, the splendor of holiness, is interesting because, again, of how it connects these things, the glory of God and his holiness, a very strong connection in these concepts. It's a phrase that David uses at least one other time in the Psalms, the splendor of holiness. The otherness of God, the purity of God is majestic and glorious, is worthy of worship. And so our response to God is this response of awe. And you see that when you see people granted a vision of God, you get this sense of an overwhelming majesty. And you can have uh, people who are granted this vision having a profound sense of their unworthiness. The vision of the glory of God is in its own way terrifying. We forget sometimes our very smallness. We're reminded of it when we see again some of the glories of nature, glories or disasters. When we see maybe images of a volcano erupting, we're reminded of our smallness. Well, once again, just magnify that and think of our smallness before God in His majesty and glory. Turning to the Psalms, however, uh, we see this worship, of course, is a relational reality. And that's something we don't want to miss. The splendor of God is not just something far away, it's not just something terrifying, but then this enters into and becomes a central feature in our relationship to God. Psalm 27, verse 4 has these words: One thing have I asked of the Lord, that will I seek after, that I may dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, to gaze upon the beauty of the Lord, and to inquire in his temple. And that is an unusual phrase. The scriptures don't often speak directly of the beauty of the Lord, but again, language of his glory, splendor, majesty, this is much, much more frequent. But it reinforces this concept. God's glory is not just terrifying, it is also uh, just fascinating. It is overwhelming in a positive sense, a sense of being the longing of the heart of those who know the Lord, to draw near to Him, to enjoy Him. To go to the Westminster Catechism. They say, "What is the chief end of man? To glorify, to uh, uh, oh boy, suddenly it's escaping me. But the last part is to enjoy him forever, and that delight in the presence of God is a part of the relationship with God, and so the beauty of God gives to the relationship with God that infinite desirability, that knowing God is the greatest of all things, for God is the most glorious of all things. And that is the destiny of God's people. So one more passage looking forward to the end. You come to Revelation chapter 21, verses 22 through 24. We're almost at the end of the Bible. And these words describe the city to come, to which the people of God will be welcomed. And here we read, And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God the Almighty and the Lamb. So the presence of God will be there in the highest form, and there will be no need of a temple, a place of intercession. God dwells there. And the city has no need of sun or moon to shine on it, for the glory of God gives it light, and its lamp is the Lamb. By its light will the nations walk, and the kings of the earth will bring their glory into it. And so the glory that is a reflected glory that humans possess in our creativity and the beauty that God has poured out on us and the things we may achieve, that glory is to be turned to the purpose of exalting God and in his service. And the glory of God is pictured as the light of the city. The splendor of God is the fundamental character of the eternal dwelling place of God's people. And so, all these thoughts about the beauty, the glory, the majesty, the splendor of God, they should give us a focus in life, that our life is about something bigger than the things of this world, that there is something greater uh, to center ourselves upon, the God who made this world, and that He has a reward that is beyond our comprehension for those who follow Him, to one day dwell in His glory and delight in Him. in a new way uh, beyond our ability to anticipate. God is infinitely beauty, and may the thought of his splendor give you unexpected strength as you go through and face the challenges of the day. May the Lord bless you and draw you ever nearer to himself.